I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Todd McGowan, Professor of Theory and Film at the University of Vermont. So where would you like to begin?
Could we begin with, God, that's a hard question. Relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that Lacan initially sees himself as Hegelian and the influence of Kojève, and I think Freud sees himself less philosophical, and even thinks of distancing himself from philosophy. And yet, I feel like there's this way in which psychoanalysis is rooted in philosophy and can't, and the more it tries to distance itself. So my point about Lacan was going to be that Lacan initially starts out thinking he's Hegelian, and I think he's not as Hegelian as he thinks. He's more Kojèvian, and then Alexander Kojève, and then I think he becomes increasingly Hegelian as he thinks he's distancing himself from philosophy. So I think it's interesting that both these key figures in psychoanalysis think that they're breaking from philosophy, and really they're rooting themselves in it in ways that, and I think what's fascinating is a lot of times they don't know. Like, I don't think that Freud probably read Hegel, and I think he read Kant just a little bit, and Descartes maybe just a little bit. So it's interesting to me that they find their way into philosophy, but not directly through the philosophers themselves. So there's something, I guess what I find interesting is there's something psychoanalytic about, that was a funny slip. There's something philosophic about the psychoanalytic enterprise itself, that if you just are pursuing it, you're dragged into philosophical problems and questions, and even the history of philosophy, because those were the preoccupations of philosophy were in some sense what will become the preoccupations of psychoanalysis.
And what do you see in Lacan's thought that makes you say that he moves more towards Hegel as he goes along?
Good question. So I think the earlier Lacan is much more interested in, he certainly takes the master-slave dialectic as one of his points of departure. He even says somewhere, I think it's in Seminar 2, that I take this as my point of departure and I keep returning to it. And so I think that's where he thinks he's Hegelian. But for me, I think that's a very small part of Hegel, and I think it often gets misread. And I think he thought of it as the struggle for recognition. So I think recognition plays a larger part in his earlier work. And then later, I think recognition falls out. And this idea, and I think the idea for Hegel, to root it in Hegel, is that ultimately what is irreducible is contradiction. And I think there's a way in which Lacan gets to that point, that there is the idea of mutual recognition certainly drops out of his. I think there's some idea that through the symbolic we can achieve mutual recognition in the early seminars. And I think in the later seminars, that idea totally drops out. And I think that's a much more Hegelian idea, that recognition fails and that desire is in some way beyond recognition. So I find that a way in which that move away from recognition, I see as a move away from a Kojèvian version of Hegel to what I would call a more real version of Hegel, or more authentic version of Hegel.
And for those who don't know, could you say a little bit more about the theory of recognition?
Sure. So the idea is that there's a struggle for recognition between two individuals, and one ends up saying, or at the end, rather than, so it's a struggle. It's a struggle for recognition that ends when one gives up. One becomes the relationship between master and slave arrives when one side of one individual in the arguments, or in the struggle, sorry, says, I give up, I don't want to be killed. And then as a result, the slave agrees to recognize the figure of the master. So that's for that, and that's a recognition that results from the struggle. But the problem is, and this is the thing that Alexander Kojève, Hegel's great interpreter of the early 20th century, says, is that the recognition that the slave gives the master is never sufficient, because it's not from, like, you want recognition from an equal, and that the slave is giving you recognition. It's not someone who's worthy of giving you recognition. So that's the problem. And so a lot of people, even today, like Robert Pippin, there are these Hegel scholars who think that we need to, the point that Hegel's making is that we need to get beyond this master-slave relationship to a situation of mutual recognition, where each side but in some way, the point of the master-slave dialectic is that you can never achieve mutual recognition. The person, like, if you recognize me, I'm never going to think. It's like, I think it's like when you have a situation of when you're liking someone, like or that old Woody Allen joke that I'll never want to join a club that would have me as a member, like that if the person is willing to recognize you, then they're not worthy of recognizing you. So I think that's the problem that Lacan ends up getting to, and that Hegel, I think, uncovers. So I think that's where this failure of recognition, that, like, an earlier investment in mutual recognition, and then an understanding that recognition ultimately fails.
Is this what your new book is about?
It's about a critique of that reading of Hegel, for sure. And it's about, one chapter is about the way that it was impossible. So this is why I guess I started on this idea that it's impossible to read Hegel correctly without the lens of psychoanalysis. So that Freud really, even though he mentions Hegel only twice and just in passing, and it's pretty clear he didn't read him, that Freud makes possible an understanding of Hegel because he's able, like, the notion of unconscious, I think, is, Hegel didn't have that idea, and it wouldn't have, in some way it wouldn't make sense to him, but I think that it's essential to his thought, because what's essential to his thought is that we are driven to act in ways that undermine our self-interest. And I think that's a basic psychoanalytic idea. And I feel like that's something that Hegel couldn't, he's still in this tradition of Aristotelian tradition of the good. And I think he couldn't quite break out of that. And so my part of the book is saying that it's only through the lens of psychoanalysis that we can reread Hegel and make and understand him, what he thought himself, but couldn't quite articulate. Even though it's sort of there, I don't want to say unconsciously, but like it's there, it's actually there articulated, but it's not utterly clear. It's not totally clear. So that's basically that's why I see psychoanalysis as important for this recovery of Hegel, I guess. I mean, other people have done it, like Slavoj Žižek has done it a lot. So it's just, my thing is much more focused on this idea of contradiction and how crucial that concept is for Hegel. And then it seems to me like that's a crucial, even though it doesn't get articulated in psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic theory quite like that. Like, I don't think people say contradiction all the time, but I think it's nonetheless a key driving, because this your unconscious has a contradictory effect, I think. So.
Why don't you say more about that?
Okay, so, well, if you have an unconscious, you're acting against, so I think one of the claims of a lot of critics of Hegel is contradiction can't be real. And I think psychoanalysis shows it can be real. I can want something, and I can unconsciously desire precisely what I don't want. So I think that to me is the great way that articulation gets manifested in psychoanalysis. It seems very simple, I think, and yet it's very, for me, very revelatory about the nature of the psyche. And then, I mean, Hegel then draws conclusions about the nature of reality and being and even nature, but which I think Freud would not draw. Like, I think Freud, just for him, it's just about the psyche and subjectivity. I think that's true of Lacan as well. And Hegel draws conclusions based on his analysis of subjectivity about the nature of being, which is a whole other thing. But I think for psychoanalysis, that, to me, that nice thing about the way you consciously want something and yet unconsciously desire to not get what you want, I find that just such a, I mean, it's disturbing, of course, but it's such a revelatory insight that Freud had.
Right, and I think it's exactly because it's disturbing that it's not more widely accepted, even though it seems very obviously true.
I know. It's almost like it can't be accepted widely because it just goes. I mean, when I was just thinking, I'm writing a book on the identity politics right now, and I was just thinking about how this idea that, there's this constant question: why are working class whites in America voting against their self-interest? And one of my things I say in the book is, well, the question isn't why are people voting, but how can they ever possibly vote in their self-interest? Like, maybe that. So I think that psychoanalysis allows us to reverse the very question and say, how is it that we're even able to ever act in our self-interest? And I think one of the problems for me of left-wing politics is that it constantly appeals to two things that I think psychoanalytic theory wants to say have no weight at all, which is knowledge and self-interest. Like, those are the two things, right? Like, I can't tell you how many left-wing documentaries I've seen, and here's like everyone is. I mean, I love documentary filmmakers; it's great, but they think if we just give enough knowledge to people, then that will save the world, or if we just get people to act in their own self-interest, and they'll stop voting for people like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or whoever. And I think that's just not true. I just think the fact that it's against their self-interest is not only a reason why they're not doing it, but it's why they are doing it. Like, that's like the fact that I think people will not. And again, I think this is a nice thing about the way the contradiction between conscious will and unconscious desire. I think their willingness or their people's proclivity for voting or acting against their self-interest is almost unchallengeable. Like, I think it's so. I think, one thing I think that left-wing movements need to do is to channel that in a way. I think that's one of the great victories of the right in the last however many years. Yeah.
Decades.
I was going to say decades, but then I thought, my God, I mean, like, that was the Nazi project as well. Like, that was like all of fascism was that. So it's a century maybe of that. Yeah.
So what led up to writing these two books?
God, I don't know. That's a good question, Vanessa. I don't know. Just I love Hegel, and so the Hegel thing. I started with a kind of relationship with Hegel in graduate school, and then it's lurked in the background. I've written mostly on psychoanalysis, and I've just kind of written a few essays, and I've always thought I just want to do but I didn't know German, so I thought I can't write a book on Hegel if I don't know, it would be like a pretender. So that's part of the reason I had to wait. So I had to learn German and then read all of Hegel in German, and that took a long time. And so it just took a while, and then I don't know. So it's been building up. I would say I want to say it's my whole life but my whole like adult life. My younger life was more mindless. But and then the one on identity politics is purely a response to our situation. Like it's purely and it's not long. It's a short thing, but I just see. I think identity and part of the problem is I think identity politics gets seen as a leftist project. I think it's completely a right-wing project, and that's one of the things that I try to do. And it's also a defense. It's more than I critique of identity politics is a defense of universality and the idea of and what constitutes the universal. And so that's just a pure response to the situation that exists today. So
can you say more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the situation of couple things. So two things. So on the one hand, the right-wing movements, which I think do not get identified as identitarian movements, when I think some people identify them that way, but I think largely they're not identified as identitarian movements, and identity politics is, college kids are guilty of it. So that's one thing I wanted to try to clarify and attack. And then on the other hand, I think on the left, since the death of Marxism, there's been a suspicion of any universalizing, and I want to try to end that suspicion. And although I have to say the Hegel book is also very critical of Marx, so it's very much a criticism of the way Hegel has gotten taken up or Hegel got taken up by Marx and then subsequently by Marxists. So it's basically a critique, obviously, of the I shouldn't say this is obvious because a lot of people think this, of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis reading of Hegel, like everything's going to work out fine. And my point is, no, Hegel's whole idea is that we end in contradiction, that's the end point, that's the absolute for him. So I don't know. So both of them have this. I don't want to say anti-Marxist because I think of this. Do you know this line by Jean-Paul Sartre where he says the anti-Marxist is a dog? So I always have that in the back of my mind that I don't want to necessarily be. But I in some way I'm kind of anti-Marxist because I feel like there's this idea of salvation in Marx that I find very gulagist. That's not a word, but like leading to the like. I'm very much against the idea of salvation and utopia and all these, which I think come from Marx. Not solely, obviously, but largely. And I think it comes from this misreading of Hegel as a philosopher of synthesis, and then Marx, like classless society communist society becomes this society without antagonism. And I think that's a very frightening image of what we should be. I don't think we should be striving for that. Not only do I think it's not realizable, but I don't think it's even I think once that's your goal, then there's a real problem.
Right. So, why would you want that to be the end result?
Right.
It absolutely sounds like all death drive to me.
That's right. That's right. So that's maybe one of the unifying things between the two books. And I mean, it's funny because I used to be very Marxist when I was younger, and it's my dad was a total conservative and I don't know how to put it, like lover of capitalism. And so when I came home and I went to college, I read Communist Manifesto or something and became and sort of proclaimed myself a Marxist. He said, God damn it, can I curse on your podcast? Can I curse? Okay. So he goes, God damn it. He goes, I sent you over to that pinko communist college and look what happened to you. So I always think like, oh, that's where I started, but that's not, I mean, I think he would be more upset with me now, but he died. But I definitely moved away from that position because I feel like that notion of, and I think one of the wagers of the book on Hegel is that there can be a Hegelian politics could replace the Marxist politics. So I mean that's a very bold thing to say, but that's that would be my dream of it, I guess. My fantasy.
And what does that dream look like?
Well, it's just so Hegel's idea is that we get to the absolute when we uncover the idea that contradiction is inescapable. And so so I feel like that's a kind of psychoanalytic, very much a psychoanalytic, something along the lines of what I would call a psychoanalytic cure, but for the society as a whole. But I think what you said earlier was really good, that there's a reason why psychoanalysis isn't popular. And I think there's also a reason why a real reading of a more authentic reading of Hegel's philosophy wouldn't be popular either. And the reason why Marxism is more popular, because it has a way, even though obviously it's not the dominant way of thinking today, I think there's a real link between capitalism and Marxism in that they both have this promise of the future free from contradiction. And so I think that to me is what I'm against, but I think that what I'm for would be a relationship to like understanding the necessity of contradiction and having a relationship to it. And so I feel like that's, part of that and so what in the book on identity politics, I linked that to the idea of universality, that universality is in some way the grasp that contradiction is necessary. And universality actually comes out of that. It comes out of like my own failure to have an identity is what puts me in touch with universality.
And why do you say your father would be more angry with you now?
That's a good question, because that just totally came out. That was like, if this is like a psychoanalytic session, that just totally came out, because I don't know that I don't know why he would, because there are ways in which he'd be proud of me, like getting a PhD, writing a lot of books. He'd be happy about that. But I don't know, because I think for the reason I said, because I think it's easier for a strict capitalist to understand a Marxist than for them to understand a psychoanalytic or Hegelian thinker. So I think that's why I said that I feel like he would, I think if I was Marxism is a thing he could hate, but he can also make sense of it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a way that understanding the necessity of contradiction just makes no sense, what's interesting is either for an analytic philosopher or for Ayn Rand, right? Like Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, she has this one whole, it's not a chapter, my God, it's like a third of the book, and the book is 1,400 pages. But it's the title of the section is called A equals A. And so her point is all of the problems in the world stem from she thinks that she gets this idea from Aristotle, which it does appear in Aristotle, but she thinks that all our problems in the world stem from our inability to reconcile ourselves to A equals A. That is, contradiction just cannot exist. That what is identical to itself. And if there's and Hegel's point is, he actually takes up this very equation, A equals A, and he's like, well, once you make the distinction between them, then they're not exactly identical. Like there's always some non-identity in there, or else you wouldn't even have the equation that would make the identity. And mm-hmm. So I find that, anyway, so I think that would be, to come back to my dad, I think that would be more, in some way, that would be more offensive to him. But I'm sad that he's not here to be offended, actually. Yeah.
But it makes sense, though, that one can understand the opposing position more than that there's like a third way or any other way. I think that's
true, don't you, Vanessa? I really think that's true. I really think that that's why I think capitalist democracy does so well with Islamic fundamentalism, right? Like it's the opposite, but in some way it shares certain basic beliefs, and so I think basic presuppositions about the nature of what they're striving for, and so I think that's why it's easy to understand, and it's easy to they can hate, but of course it's.
Right, it keeps them in the same dynamic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how did you get into psychoanalysis in the first place?
That is a good question. So I was in graduate school. I was anti-psychoanalytic because I thought I was Marxist. That's what I was. So I thought psychoanalysis, bourgeois, individualist. But I had a professor, Walter Davis, who wrote a book called Inwardness and Existence, and he was very influential on me. He's like, you should read Freud. You're not. And I'm like, it just turns into psychic problems what are really existential or social problems. And I sort of held to that position. And then I read, I remember this very well. It was 1992. It was over Christmas break. I was part of this theory reading group, and we were going to read Slavoj Žižek's Sublime Object of Ideology for January. And I said, I'm on vacation. I was seeing my girlfriend at the time, Hillary Neroni, who's now my spouse. And I said, I'll read it. And I started to read the book. And I remember calling my friend on the phone. And I said, stop whatever you're doing. Just go get this book, start reading it. And so it was really Sublime Object of Ideology that converted me and I think all I had read before was Alan Sheridan's translation of the Écrit, and that was like, I don't know, all that has ever done is turn people away from Lacan. So, and then once I read sublime object. Then I read Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis, and then everything was changed for me. So it was really Slavoj that really, because, and then Lacan, and then I went back to Freud. So Freud came last, and so it was like Zizek, Lacan, Freud. It was just exactly backwards. But it was because it intervened in this political, social way, and then that sort of got me back to seeing the way in which the psyche already had all these questions that I thought were just social questions were actually psychic questions, maybe even more so. So that was really important for me. And also the way in which I wonder what you think about this. Also the way in which Lacan, I thought, as I read Seminar 11 and then Seminar 7 and Seminar 3, those were the first three I read, that I felt like he really was existential in his approach to psychoanalysis. And I never saw that. I mean, I think I was wrong, but I never saw that in Freud. And so I viewed Lacan as very much like he was, I thought he was Sartrean with the unconscious. Mm. That's what I thought. Like I thought, this is great. This is like being in nothingness, but without the stupid, pre-reflexive cogito, but instead we have the unconscious. And so I just thought it was amazing. And it was, but I have to say it was Slavoj that paved the way for me to see that. But yeah, so I don't know. Do you think that's true? Like, I think he's really part of that mid 20th century French existentialist tradition, although totally different because they're all focused on conscious, freedom. And
right, but that makes sense, especially when you compare it to Freud, because Freud was trying to move away from this kind of like spiritual church-based ideas and trying to make it more into biology. So he was really trying to bring all of these ideas and match them with biology, which Lacan was not doing.
Right, absolutely not doing. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned
Lacan brought it back.
Yeah. I love that way of putting it. Yeah, I think that's really good. I think it's really good. I mean, what do you think about his relationship to religion, Lacan? Like, I think it's almost the opposite of Freud's, right?
In what way?
Well, just that you focused the question on me. I asked you the question. I don't think he's religious, but I think he thinks the religious experience is really revelatory and in some way, I would say, necessary. Whereas Freud, religions are the mass delusions of humanity, right? Like, I think that he just has no truck with it. And
right, but he kind of sticks to it more structurally than Lacan does, I think.
Oh, say more about that.
I don't know. I feel like his writing kind of maintains this bit of structural Abrahamic patriarchal kind of stance that he was trying to get out of, but I don't think he was really able to fully. And I feel like Lacan's able to more.
Do you mean in style or
yeah, just his way of thinking.
Yeah. So he's more of a Judeo-Christian thinker than he thinks.
I think so.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking that for Lacan, isn't it that religion is in some way necessary because of the blank space within the other? Like, that blank space is religion is just a way of thematizing that or something, right? Or filling it in or something. But it's also a way of acknowledging it. And so I think, yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I love what you said about Freud. Have you thought about that a lot? Like his actual debt to the religious, or the way he's repeating the religious structure.
Yeah, I think, it sounds similar to this kind of capitalist Marxist thing. Like, he was so opposed to it, but he remained in the same dynamic instead of finding kind of a new way. But maybe, that was enough to get out of it as he could at that time. And maybe Lacan was able to get out of it further because Freud had made that step,
Yeah, I like that. But I think your point about biology is crucial, though. That I think you're right. Like, Freud, that seems to be a constant worry for him, is how he can root what he's saying in biology. And then I think Lacan really doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, I think that's what Freud was trying to do, just keep it valid. I feel like he thought that was the only way that he could validate what he was saying. Where at the same time, of course, he wrote and reflected and changed his mind all the time, and that was wonderful. But he always seemed to try to come back to rooting it in biology in that way.
Yeah.
But I think it would have been maybe just too much of a leap not to do that at the time. Or they might have thrown him into, hocus pocus that he didn't want to do.
Well, I mean, he got that anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. I think that's interesting because Lacan, don't you think it's probably Saussure that makes what the gesture that Lacan, I mean, Saussure and others, and Levi-Strauss as well, that sort of give him a grounding for making the step that he makes. I was just looking in Seminar 16 from the other to another, and he says there that he rereads the Project for Scientific Psychology, the 1895 Freud unpublished, and he reads the biology there. This obviously through signification, right? Like so for him, whenever Freud's talking about biology and neurons, etc., he's really talking about signifiers. And I think what's interesting is it gives a different kind. It's not a way of escaping a grounding in some kind of discipline, but it just changes the discipline, right? It changes it from biology to linguistics.
Yeah, signification. I like that a lot. I haven't read that, and that makes a lot of sense because when I read the project, I mean, you could see psychoanalysis all over it, even at that early stage. He's trying to be a neurologist, but...
Oh, I know. It's amazing. I mean, I think there's a way in which you could see that as a really key work of his. But you have to translate it into the way that I think Lacan does. Which is, yeah.
So, what else would you like to talk about?
That's a good question. Hegel.
Maybe we should talk about the violence book that just came out.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Since you contributed a lovely chapter to it.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that book. Yeah. So why don't you talk about what inspired you to put it together, and then I will talk about my thing.
Sure. So I worked at a hospital in Brooklyn, an HIV clinic, for many years. And was extremely frustrated with the treatment of my patients by the medical care system, the mental health care system, and that hospital system. Because when I first moved to New York, I was very excited getting a job at a hospital in New York, working for the government. These are good jobs, quote unquote, right? Planned to be there forever, right? And then reality was very different. The hospital was really, really filthy. Sometimes sewer lines would open up. I mean, that level of filthy inside the hospital. And I have patients with HIV and AIDS, and, the workers there would call me, my upper management would call me kind of a diva for not wanting to walk my AIDS patients by open sewage during the day. And it was that level of terrible. Wow. When I say it's terrible. So, seeing that, and then, it was 2008 when I moved to New York, so the economy was collapsing, and they didn't have any layoffs at the hospital at the time, but what they decided to do was to stop filling positions when people would leave. So say when I started there were 8 of us. When I left 5 years later, there were like 3 of us, and we were seeing just as many patients. So I was seeing people for like 20 minutes, like 3 patients an hour every other week, for their mental health treatment. So it was really frustrating, really terrible. When they tried to cut like Medicaid benefits, and Medicaid would only start paying for certain medications and not other medications. But when you're treating people with HIV, you can't just give them any HIV medication. There's this long process of giving them combinations of medications to try to figure out which combination suppresses their strain of the virus. And like after all of this work that the hospital was doing to treat people, then all of a sudden half the medications aren't being covered. And only the other half was, and then all my patients are getting switched to these medications that aren't working, and we're getting sick, and this sort of thing. So it was very disheartening to see, and I felt very helpless. What can I do? And eventually I had to leave the hospital just because it was making me sick working there. So I just had to leave. And then I met Manya around that time and was complaining to her about all of this. And she was talking to me about training in France and like working with psychotic patients with Guy Dana there, and like these amazing ways he was setting up these like communities and helping people live in these kinds of environments that weren't so constrictive, and letting their symptoms kind of play out and trying to understand them instead of just medicating everyone and trying to, control them. And it was like such a night and day difference between like the system that I was working in, the system that she was telling me about. I was like, we need to talk more about this. And then we decided to have this conference kind of addressing these like systemically violent issues. Like, why are patients here in America being treated this way? What can we do differently? Let's look at some other systems and that sort of thing. So that's why we had this conference in 2015. On like systemic violence. And then, like, I guess it was the year before last, we decided like we should really make a book out of kind of collective papers from that conference. But since everything was happening with the election and everything, we decided to kind of focus it more on like current systemic issues in America more so. So that's how the book came about.
Oh, cool.
And then you contributed your paper on eroticizing biopower. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so the idea for that paper came from so this idea of biopower is that power takes hold of the body, and that the control of bodies is the primary way in which power operates today. So it does, and rather than being functioning as a prohibition, like thou shalt not do whatever, that power instead is productive. This is an idea that comes from Michel Foucault, that power actually gets you to think about your body and gets you to think of and constantly gets you to live. So it wants to produce life. It wants to produce concern for life, like an Apple Watch would be a perfect emblem of biopower. And so one of the other manifestations of biopower, I think people would say, is the security lines at airports. So the idea that we're going to protect the ultimate goal of government is protection of life. That would be a biopolitical form. And what was interesting to me, so I went to I like everyone, I guess, I go to the airline at the airport and I think, it's kind of funny. For one thing, it's funny that you can't tell a joke, right? Like then if you tell a joke, you're automatically, I think you're off I don't know what happened to you, but it's not good. But the other thing is they do this weird thing where they say, you go through the scanner and then they say, can I touch you? First they have latex gloves on, which I find strange. And then they say, can I touch you? Would you mind? And I even was touched. She goes, I think it was a guy, so they do have guy on guy because they don't believe in homosexual desire, I guess. But the guy goes, can I touch you in the groin area? And so that's what actually inspired me to write this essay, because I thought, well, that's odd that it's really about protecting. They say it's about protecting our life, but what's really going on, I think, is there's a way in which what's at the heart of what seems like biopolitical protection of life is actually how do we construct desire. And so I feel like they're trying to, that it was really a place where we could all of a sudden start to desire again. Like that, and that seemed to me like that was in some way that there's a real, and I think I draw this conclusion in the essay, that there's a link between the searching by the TSA agent and the way that, like at the certain private colleges where you have to ask, like, may I remove your top, and then can I touch your, and then it's the same thing. It's the parallel between the two sexual acts. I mean, the one's not a sexual act, but is pretty clear. And so my point was that this protection against violence is actually an attempt there's a sexual dimension to it, an attempt to arouse desire. And so and I don't know if I think this is a larger idea, but I do feel like a lot of times, I do think this is a larger idea, that a lot of times that we when we think we're protecting life, what we're really doing is trying to re-arouse ourselves or re-eroticize ourselves. And so the menace of terrorism at large, I think, is part of that re-eroticization of life. Because I think what's interesting is capitalism is in many ways a de-eroticization of the social world. And so you need these other erotic forms to then make capitalism, make us be able to be invested in it, because it's very hard. I think it's very hard to just be invested as a pure capitalist unless you're one of these psychotic, like Bill Gates or whoever. But I feel like that for other people, the way that you get invested in it is through this like threat of violence, which then creates a sexual. My point in the essay is that it creates then a sexual involvement in what you're doing. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's too wildly psychoanalytic, but I don't know. I'm pretty convinced by it, and I part of it is I see a danger in this, what I think is like Foucauldian power analysis, and I feel like that's one of the things that the academic world is caught in. And you were talking about the way psychoanalysis is kind of marginalized. I think it's marginalized by this power analysis of every dynamic. Like that's the way everything gets analyzed, is in terms of power. And I feel like that's that part of what psychoanalytic theory does is introduce sex into power and sex into violence. So that's what that essay was trying to do.
Right. So these threats and sort of things bring this like arousal and tension and stuff that's sort of like capitalism with this endless like feeding and buying. Nothing's ever satisfied. It makes everything really dull. And I
think that's right. Yeah. I think it's dull. I think it's basically like, think about how boring it is to go shopping, or, I mean, like there's a little thrill.
It's like numbing.
Yeah, it's numbing. Exactly. And I think the threat of violence then kind of, or like other things, like I think racism has this function. I think homophobia has this. I think all these kind of things have this function of bringing a little spark of enjoyment into the capitalist, into this desire, into the dry capitalist pure consumption. So I feel like it could not survive without these different supplements, like racism, threat of fundamentalist violence, etc.
Right, so maybe that's why the people that tend to benefit from capitalism tend to also continue to spark those fires.
Exactly. It's funny that I think Lacan said that the capitalist world can't survive without a war every 10 years, and I mean that was a wild underestimation, but I think it's true. I think it needs a constant, permanent state.
Constant war, yeah.
It's declared or not, and but even when we have a sort of president to the left like Obama, there was not really, even though he campaigned on promising to stop the permanent war, he didn't really do it. So, I think there is a way in which it needs that, rather than, and so, I mean, that's basic, but I think what's great about psychoanalysis is the way that it shows the sexuality of the violence, like that violence is never just an attempt to destroy life, that it's an attempt, that there's a charge of enjoyment to it, and without that, then we wouldn't engage in it.
Right, and that goes along with, people think that this like sex and aggression are opposite poles, but actually they're like the same side. There's the same drive, and the death drive is like this inertia or this deadening. Sex and aggression are both at least trying to do something.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that, I don't know. I mean, I think there's different readings of death. Like Slavoj has a pretty particular reading of death drive, and
what's his?
Well, his is that death drive is precisely the thing. It's what you described as not the death drive. So it's precisely the thing that repeats and keeps us going. That it's the repetition of whatever it is that we do. Like it's that drive of repetition, and not a drive to eliminate all excitation. So, but I think that, I don't know, to me, it's not important about the terminology, but I do think what's interesting is, I think you're right that aggression and sex are linked together, and that they're both trying to cause trouble. And I think, I love this idea in psychoanalysis that the causing trouble is what, I think that's the big change that Freud makes in 1920 when he goes to Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I think the idea is that we get enjoyment, and I think Lacan will make a lot out of this, but so early idea of the pleasure principle is we just want to get rid of excitation, right? And that produces pleasure. But then I think later on he comes to think, no, there's something about the causing trouble for ourselves that is enjoyable in itself. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that shift, that it's not just pleasure getting rid of excitation, but actually arousing excitation, causing trouble, that there's enjoyment in that. And I think that seems to me to be his great breakthrough. And I think that's what Lacan mainly takes up. So I find that and back to that essay, that was a driving thing of that essay, that it's not just like, let's get rid of this trouble, let's get rid of the potential for violence with people coming through the screening, but let's actually cause trouble for ourselves, So I feel like that's the key psychoanalytic idea.
Yeah, and that's something that I think would be very helpful for a wider public to understand, that maybe we enjoy the trouble.
Yeah. I know. That's the thing, right? Because
you can't get rid of the trouble.
Ties back to what we were saying about Marx earlier, right? Like, I think there's a dream in Marxism of getting rid of the trouble, and what makes life interesting is the trouble, and I think that what makes life enjoyable is the trouble. And then I feel like you're right. But I mean, I think you're right that's at once the great insight of psychoanalysis, but that's the thing and it would be great if that had a wider dissemination, but people don't want to hear that. Like, that is something I think there's a real resistance to hearing that, I don't know. I feel like because it's nice to think that if I could just, and I think if you think about Lacan's concept of object A, as the barrier that you enjoy, then I think that also makes sense about the trouble, right? Like you enjoy if you get rid of the thing that's stopping you from fully realizing your desire, you think you're going to really get it, and instead that you're going to lose everything, because it's the very barrier that is the thing that makes that arouses you, that gives you that gives you your enjoyment.
Also, with the TSA agent, what would happen if you said no? Like, no, you can't touch my groin. That'd just lead to more trouble.
I literally know. I know. No one knows. Everyone knows not to say it. So it's probably worse than joking, saying no. Yeah. Although when I was a kid, I used to joke. I mean, not a kid, but like in high school or college, I would joke. It used to be fine to joke.
Yeah, but that was all pre-9/11.
Yeah, that's right. That was the change.
So things really did change.
Yeah. But I would say, like, they said, do you have anything in your bag? They'd be like, yeah, just a bomb, whatever. And then it was funny. Like, they would laugh. But now, like, God, you can't say that.
So what's next for you, Todd?
Next for me? Well, I'm teaching something starting tomorrow, a class on Star Trek and psychoanalysis, actually. So we're starting out reading Freud, and then we're going to watch Star Trek. So that'll be fun. But book-wise, I'm writing a book on this thing that we just talked about power versus enjoyment in politics. So I'm trying to say the very thing that you just said, that politics should focus on the trouble, the necessity of the trouble, and the enjoyment that causes, rather than thinking that power is the answer. So that's what I'm going to do.
That sounds like a good place to stop.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Vanessa. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, it was super fun.
Answer.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard an interview with Todd McGowan, a professor of theory and film at the University of Vermont. Dr. McGowan has authored several books, including Only a Joke Can Save Us, A Theory of Comedy, Capitalism and Desire, The Psychic Cost of Free Markets, Contemporary Film Directors, Spike Lee, The Fictional Christopher Nolan, Enjoying What We Don't Have, The Political Project of Psychoanalysis, The Real Gaze, Film Theory After Lacan, and The Impossible David Lynch. His forthcoming book is by Columbia University Press and is entitled Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution. Todd McGowan also contributed to On Psychoanalysis and Violence, Contemporary Lacanian Perspectives, a book edited by myself and Dr. Magnus Steinkohler. His chapter, The Sex in Their Violence, Eroticizing Biopower. He also hosts his own podcast with Ryan Engley called Why Theory. For more information and links to all of these, please visit renderingunconscious.org or my website, drvanessasinclair.net. Thank you.
we share a happy place. Inside me is outside you. Inside you is outside me. Connecting at the surface.